Our first panelist is one of the reasons we're here, Dr. Dmitri Glinski, the president of the Russian-speaking Community Council of Manhattan and the Bronx. Dr. Glinski is a graduate of Harvard with a master's in general management. He also holds a master's in international affairs from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Glinski has served as consultant to the chief librarian of the U.S. Congress and was a faculty member at Columbia University for 5 years. He has authored and co-authored dozens of publications in Russian and American media, including the Los Angeles Times, the Journal of Democracy, and the Jewish Week. Dr. Dmitri Glinski.
Good evening, добрый вечер. I must say that for someone who came to this country almost 20 years ago with only 2 years of English, home study of English, it's a great, exceptional privilege to be speaking about my community in this distinguished audience. And I want to thank, on behalf of our organization, first and foremost Ms. Bertha Lewis and her wonderful team. Ms. Bertha Lewis is really an exceptional civil rights leader who is the only one I know who took the problems and the concerns of recent immigrants in the Russian immigrant community so close to her heart. And it's a great privilege for us to be working together. And this event, of course, was organized in a very short period of time. Everybody is busy, but Ms. Lewis is more busy than any of us. She is now the member of the transition team of our next mayor. And we even, talking about ourselves, we call her the representative of our joint progressive Afro-Russian bloc on that team, especially since of Russian Americans, the Russian American immigrants are neither on the transition team nor in the past or the incoming city council. So for us it's a great alliance, and I would like all of you to give Bertha a round of applause, please. Okay, so we came here for two distinct topics that I will be trying to cover. They are directly connected to each other, but not that obviously as it might seem. It will be our joint work to connect them here. The first topic is the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's talking about the oppression of Jews in the Soviet Union. And we together identify this as a sort of meeting point and a potential moment in Black Russian and Black Jewish history, recent history and relations that we want to reflect upon with you here. The other topic is the joint advocacy of Russian and Black progressive leaders and organizations for the unprivileged and disadvantaged of our days, for the present and future immigrants. So let me start with Martin Luther King. I'm of course not a practicing historian, even though my, as they call it, terminal degree is indeed in 20th century history, but I'm looking at these events really from the point of view of a community organizer, because I believe that we only can move forward by understanding where we all are coming from and where our community is coming from. Dr. King got himself involved in the cause of Soviet Jewry shortly after the march on Washington for jobs and freedom. And he responded to the invitation of Moshe Dekter, a humble man who didn't hold any significant senior position, and he was only one of the very few Americans concerned with Soviet Jews at the time. Must be also noted that there was no organized Jewish Protestant Soviet Union in that period, that this was the beginning of detente in Soviet-American relations, and very few, no Jewish organization in America was working on Soviet-Jewish problems. So one really had to have a foresight and a deep sense of injustice and deep empathy to understand that this was a problem that was not on many's radar screen, but was going to become a major international issue in the years to come. So on October 21st, 1963, Dr. King took part in the conference convened by Dekter, and he co-signed an appeal to conscience, of which only one point, number 5, was about immigration, and it was thought at the time as almost an only immigration to Israel. Then, next slide, please. Next month, on November 20th, he gave 2 sets of remarks to 2 major Jewish denominations. And here is a photo of him standing with Rabbi Heschel, of course, on the right, and George Mason, who was the head of the United Synagogue, to the left. And even though in both cases his remarks his remarks on Soviet Jews were just one paragraph out of his entire speech, they were so central that they were the most commented upon in the American press. Also, next slide shows the paragraph from the speech that he gave, apparently on the same day, to the Reform Union, the future Union of Reform Judaism. In this way, King and his persona, the civil rights movement in the U.S., happened to be present at the birth of a major international movement that leads us straight to where we are today. This movement became known as Let My People Go, or the Soviet Jewry movement, and it was the most visible part of a larger fight of Jews and non-Jews for minority rights in the USSR, including the most fundamental right to be able to leave the country. And this is one key difference between us, Russian Americans, and many other immigrant communities today. Unlike them, the older generation in the Russian American community had to fight for the right to exit, which left most with little interest or resources to fight for a better deal in their new country, unfortunately. This movement for the freedom of exit eventually led to immigration of about 1 million of Russian speakers of various faiths to the US. And it was part of an even larger movement for democratic reforms that, by bringing down the one-party rule, contributed to the end of the Cold War that had placed such a heavy burden on both America and Russia. So now let me quickly walk you through some of the milestones of that movement. In 1964, the student struggle for Soviet Jewry was created, and we are very privileged to have one of its leaders, Glenn Ritter, here with us today, who will be speaking later. I look forward to celebrating half a century of that organization next year. 1965, the removal of the national origins quotas from the U.S. immigration law made the large-scale immigration of Soviet Jews a more realistic topic for conversation. 1969, the start of the Jewish immigration movement, the refugee movement within the Soviet Union. 1971, the founding of the National Conference on Soviet Jewry, whose founding executive director, Mr. Jerry Goodman, is also, we are privileged to have him among us here today. He will also speak later. 1974, the adoption of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which conditioned trade with Soviet Union on Jewish immigration. And one must say that this idea was not exactly favored by the Nixon administration, to put it mildly. In fact, as we now know from the tapes, State Secretary Henry Kissinger was telling Nixon at the same time, literally quote, that if all Soviet Jews were gassed by their government, this would not be an American concern. Well, fortunately for many Americans, including many black civil rights leaders, they felt the opposite. Thus, the next slide, the one that was shown before in 1975, New York black leaders called upon their community to join the Solidarity Sunday for Soviet Jews, with some very important words that I quote here. Just as the color of our skins has historically set us apart and subjected us to the same discriminations, we see the parallel and we will feel the need to speak out. These words were important because they recognize the underlying quasi-racial divide in the Soviet Union, which was not very well understood by many others. For many Americans in the Soviet Jewry movement, the primary causes of their protest were first the suppression of the Jewish religion, and second, the denial of exit visas, mostly to Israel. Both very important causes of discontent for many Soviet Jews, and yet many other educated big city Jews did not care that much about religion regardless of government suppression. And while loving and admiring Israel, they were not also exactly looking to go there. For these people, the root cause of their struggle was really the lack of equal economic opportunity. 1978, Protestant denominations in the Soviet Union mounted their own campaign with a 10,000-strong appeal to the US Congress for the right to immigrate. And they borrow from the Jewish movement the biblical line, "Let my people go." 1980, the Refugee Act really created the most humane system of refugee integration, immigrant integration thus far. Those Russians who were able to come under this law when refugee quotas were high had a great advantage in terms of their starting conditions in America compared to everyone who came later. 1987, the March in Washington for Soviet Jews, not surprisingly borrowing from the experience and the imagery of 1963 March. 1989, Lautenberg Amendment eased the refugee process, not only for Jews but also for other religious minorities. And finally, 1991, the freedom of immigration was won. All this brings us now here. In the remaining time, I would like to talk about three things. First, the present state of the Russian-American community. Second, the struggle of the Jewish part of this community for integration in American society and its relation with the Jewish world. And third, our relations with the black community and the emerging alliance of progressive folks, in both of them in pursuit of a fair and comprehensive immigration reform. The first thing to know, our tribe is highly diverse. Religiously, ideologically, by their immigrant experiences, depending on the time and status of their arrival, and in economic terms. Those who came as refugees when Soviet Union was still a superpower got a much better deal than those who came after their native country collapsed, and under different kinds of visas. Also, most of the refugee wave know little or nothing, unfortunately, about the civil rights movement. Instead, they tend to thank Ronald Reagan and his party for the reception and the benefits they got. We need to educate the folks and acknowledge also respect the reality of their experience while providing a platform for the newer and more progressive crop of immigrants, given that about 10,000 Russian natives are getting only by permanent resident visas to the United States every year. We also need to address prejudice, including racism and anti-immigrant sentiment in the older part of our community that's often fueled by right-wing media in South Brooklyn. Our goal is to gradually transform the entire community through successful examples of working together with other minorities and educating it about the role played by their visionaries such as Dr. King in our own past. In economic terms, Russian Americans are polarized. We have a small number of super rich who do not really participate in the community. Meanwhile, over 70% of Russian Jewish elderly live in dire poverty. Many of them immigrated while still in their working age, with education and skills, but did not secure stable employment. And we have very little in between. Few Russian immigrants in middle-class jobs, in civil service, non-profit world, and large private corporations. Only a tiny handful in management and executive positions. Our biggest challenge, indeed of tragic proportions, is the relatively large number of long-term under and unemployed, some of our best and brightest, most educated and skilled, including those with background in public affairs and government service. Some have both Russian and American graduate degrees. Not that many of them, but the stumbling blocks that they face are a true calamity, not just for them and their families, but for all of us. Because some of them are the most natural leaders of the community, should be a resource to others. We urge our friends in the black community to stand with us in saying that when people who have foreign and American graduate degrees and professional experience have not been accused of anything wrong or criminal, and cannot get employed year after year, and the only thing different about them is that they come from Russia, that this is something wrong, that this is un-American, that these instances should be public and maybe government level concern. On the flip side of this coin, Russian immigrants are virtually not represented at all in professional positions on the staff of government offices in the areas of significant Russian population, such as Upper Manhattan. In September, we submitted several hundreds of signatures under a petition to our esteemed Congressman, Honorable Mr. Rangel, urging him and all other elected officials in the area to help create one position for Russian public affairs professionals in one of the government offices in the area. We trust that our voices will be heard. Second, Russian Jews in the American Jewish world. A highly sensitive topic, but I've already been speaking about it in other places, so I don't think I have much to lose, really. There is no other large community to which Russian Jewish and even non-Jewish immigrants feel closer and more intimately related than the American Jewish world. We are all committed to its strength, unity, and success. And a number of its agencies continue their exceptional job at providing very basic things to our most needy immigrants. That said, the times when the only or even the most likely path to integration of Russian Jewish immigrants into the wider American society led through the American Jewish world, my personal opinion and experience, these times are over. Today, in political and economic terms, Russian Jews are really a people in its own, rather than a subset of American Jewish world. This was plain to see in the city council elections in South Brooklyn, when US-born Jewish candidates competed ferociously and defeated all Russian Jewish immigrant candidates. And while some of the limits to possible integration are recent and very real, and they include shrinking resources in the community, there are some also deeper historical barriers. One is a history of inequality within the Jewish world, which was very well documented by 20th century Russian-American Jewish economist, Nobel Prize winner Simon Kuznets, who established in his research that the inequality within the Jewish community in America over time was higher than in any other communities. There's also this inequality has kind of shown itself in the data over the last decade, which means before the recession, about 70% of American Jews had incomes over $35,000 a year, while for Russian Jewish immigrants it was just the opposite. About 70% made less than $35,000 a year. There is a second historical barrier not unrelated to the first. It is the legacy of European racial divides, of the notion of cultural superiority of European West over the East that was internalized by the more affluent German Jews and imported to America. Whatever the reason, while Russian Jewish immigrants make up to 20% of all New York Jewish population, they hold merely 1 to 2% of decision-making positions in Jewish communal service, and no such jobs at all in any of what is known as Jewish social justice organizations. Well, what makes us hopeful really is that East European Jewish immigrants had known better times, especially during the civil rights movement. Let me just mention Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was perhaps the closest ally of Dr. King in the Jewish world. And I often hear laments in various Jewish organizations, where is Heschel today? Why don't we have someone like Rabbi Heschel now who would be able to relate to the blacks and other minorities like he did? Well, few of those asking maybe remember that Heschel was an immigrant, a Polish Jew born in the Russian Empire who fled from European racism. He came to New York in his 30s, having only published a book of Yiddish poems, wasn't asked to validate his credentials, didn't get another degree, and yet was hired to teach full-time at the most prestigious Jewish seminary across the street, which gave him the basics essentially for a larger leadership role. Today, I'm afraid he would likely be offered at best an adjunct position, on which he wouldn't be able to survive. He would be looking for a job outside of the academia and turned down as overqualified, not the right fit around peg in the square hole. His prophetic criticism of inequalities around him would not have helped him either. He may not have been able to make it to Selma, or would have come there invisible, hiding from the cameras. This, of course, not just about how our very own Jewish world has changed. It's also perhaps more so about how our entire economy and educational system have changed, making the recognition of such immigrant talents much less likely, especially if they come from smaller, less assertive communities with less of a political muscle, like Russian or African immigrants. In light of all these complexities, shall I say, some of us who are also present here have been organizing as Russian Americans of different faiths, united by our language and history, and redefining ourselves through dialogue with other minorities. This is precisely what RCCMB, our organization, was created to do over 2 years ago, when we held our very first event with a Latino organization. And this is why we are proud to have joined forces with the Black Institute and other allies around immigration reform. We see this as a sequel to the civil rights struggles that helped our own folks to come here. On immigration reform, many think of this as the legalization of the undocumented, predominantly Latinos, and RCCMB fully supports this as the only sensible, humane, and realistic solution. But even though there are a few such people in our community. But for Russians, the reform bill includes other essential provisions no one is really talking about, such as the expansion of the Lautenberg Amendment that was mentioned today for persecuted minorities, more flexibility for asylum seekers, removal of language requirements for elderly immigrants who want to naturalize, etc. Provisions for refugee and asylum seekers are particularly key, given the authoritarian, oppressive policies in Russia and some other post-Soviet countries, versus the ridiculously low rate of approval of refugee applications from Russia. We also share the view of the Black Institute that the bill could and should be made much more progressive and more reflective of the needs of the smaller, more disadvantaged communities like Russian, African, and others. It should retain the diversity visa that has benefited immigrants from underrepresented countries. Likewise, it should include more robust integration and equal opportunity provisions. And to conclude, I think one of Dr. King's favorite quotations was from John Donne, "No man is an island." You've heard it here. No immigrant or minority group is an island either. But for many of us, it makes a conscious effort to broaden our horizons to be able to see it. We are fortunate to be making this effort with all of you here today for the benefit of our communities and for the future of our country. Thank you very much for joining us on this exceptional occasion.